have to imagine a fairly typical experience for new brewers involves excitedly cracking open a bottle of their first batch of homemade beer, gently pouring it into a glass, giddy with the fact it actually carbonated, then raising said glass to one's lips, only to be let down by the fact it doesn't taste nearly as good as one expected. Those of a more committed bent will head to the internet and start doing some research into ways to improve the beer that they're making, and very quickly find themselves reading about perhaps the biggest mistake made by brewers of bad beer. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and fellow contributor Malcolm Frazer is joining me on this episode to talk about fermentation temperature, particularly in regards to how it impacts ale.
One of the most commonly spouted advice for controlling your beer flavor in general would be temperature, right? So I think one of the most common things people say is temperature goes up, you get more esters, sometimes they say more phenols, and obviously ales tend to be higher temperature, so more esters, phenols, more character, more flavor compounds put into your beer as a result of temperature.
Well, and I think one of the big arguments as well that you hear nowadays is that a lot of off flavors and that like I mentioned, kind of bad beer is a function of poorly controlled fermentation temperature, and usually I think for most people, fermentation temperature is getting too warm. When you're going to the homebrew shop and you pick up your first equipment kit, you're not really considering fermentation temperature control at that point, or at least I didn't. When I got into it. Now, I was fortunate enough to get my start while living in northern Washington State, so it was kind of cool out, and it was actually wintertime, so it was super easy. We kept our apartment at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C. So obviously, not everyone has that luxury. And where I live now, if I were to go and start today and not have a dedicated fermentation chamber, it'd be really difficult for me. In fact, I'd probably feel pretty let down. My beer would probably be getting up close to 80 degrees Fahrenheit if I were to be fermenting in the summertime at ambient temps. So does it really matter as much as some seem to think? That's what we're going to be talking about in this show. But hey, if you're a brewer who likes the more sciencey side of beer, consider joining the Brew Club. It's totally free and offers members all sorts of rad opportunities, one of which is having an experiment that you design and perform published on brewlosophy.com. On top of that, members of the Brew Club who tag photos of their brew day on social media with hashtag brew-a-beer, that's BRU a beer, or hashtag Brewlosophy, will be entered into a drawing to have their photo featured in the Hopbeat, our regular newsletter, and receive some fresh Brewlosophy stickers as well. Learn more about becoming a member at thebrewclub.com. That's thebruclub.com. And make sure to subscribe to the Hopbeat using the form in the sidebar over at Brewlosophy.com. Cheers to everyone who's been using our links to do their online shopping. It's a huge help. If you like what we're doing, please consider heading over to Brewlosophy.com/support and using the links you find there when doing all of your online shopping. Super easy way to support us, and you don't feel a thing. We also offer rewards for your support. You can head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy to learn how you can get rad things like unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, a chance to win a $50 Love to Brew gift certificate, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a very special guest, just for pledging as little as $1 a month. Coming up in just a couple of weeks, patrons are going to have the opportunity to ask questions of Mecca Grade Estate Malt's Seth Klon, a super cool dude who is well-versed in all things grain as well as brewing. We've got Russian River's Vinny Chilurzo and Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the UC Davis Brewing Program scheduled as well. Head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy now to learn more about the rewards you can get for helping us to bring you this show. We do have a couple of events coming up we want to let you all know about in just a few short weeks. Malcolm, you're going to be joining Brian and I up in Yakima for Hop Harvest, as well as to attend a couple of rad events while we're there. The Fresh Hop Party is hosted by Yakima Valley Hops. That happens on Friday night, September 28th. They're going to have 4 dope bands playing, a ton of fresh hop beer pouring, and apparently yours truly is going to be helping to host. Then the next night, Saturday, September 29th, is the annual Fresh Hop Ale Festival, which has been rated one of the top 10 best beer festivals in the world. You can get your tickets for both of those events now so that we can have a fun time hanging out together. Make sure you let us know if you're there. We've also got some other cool stuff planned while we're going to be up there. We're going to do collaborations with Wandering Hop Brewing, Varietal Beer Company. We're going to be recording some shows. Basically, we're just going to be hanging out at one of the coolest events, one of the funnest times of the year, in my opinion, when it comes to beer and brewing. So again, if you're around, please let us know. We'd love to meet up. Coming up in March of 2019, Denny Kahn and I are going to be leading a couple seminars on experimentation and brewing for the Brew Your Own Boot Camp in Asheville, North Carolina. Tickets go fast for this, so make sure to secure yours as soon as possible if you plan to attend. If you haven't already, please consider leaving a rating and review of this show in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts. It's one of the easiest ways to help folks who might not know about us to find the show. Feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique and hard to find items for both the home and craft brewing markets, including high quality stainless fittings at competitive prices and very fast shipping. If you're into electric brewing, you've got to check out the BCS 482 control system. It provides everything needed to fully automate your brewery. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Okay, Chris McKenzie, who runs the Brew You blog, wrote in with a point of clarification. He said, on your episode covering mash length, that was episode 47, you seem to indicate both that enzymes denature at a certain temperature and also that they would reactivate once the mash temperature dropped back down to the range that particular enzyme is active. In particular, the comment about mash temperature dropping, allowing all the enzymes in there to work. As a point of clarity for listeners who might not be aware, enzyme denaturing is not something that happens all at once. Rather, it is a process that happens gradually, but more rapidly at higher temperatures. So if the height of an enzyme's optimal range is 149 degrees Fahrenheit, that doesn't mean all those enzymes are completely denatured at the magical number of 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and that they aren't working above that temperature. This is why we can mash between the optimal ranges of alpha and beta amylase for single infusion mashing and have both enzymes be active. I'm sure you're aware of this, but the conversation in this episode seemed to imply other things, and I felt it was important to clarify. Malcolm, what do you think, man?
Yeah, it's not a switch. The commenter is correct. It doesn't happen all at once, and for lots of reasons. One, it's a process that is almost like an unraveling of the enzyme, denaturing of the enzyme,
right? So
that it no longer works. If you want to use that key analogy, it no longer works in its key-like function.
Yeah.
However, so it works because it is a process of become denatured, but also, the water and the temperature don't have uniform access. It's not completely homogeneous, so they don't have access to everything all at once. That's just not how nature works. So that's another aspect of it. It might not be, super hot in one area while it's warmer in other areas, and the hydration ratio is different. So the hydration ratio and the pH also both affect the rate at which these enzymes denature.
Right.
And I'm surprised he didn't also, he did mention that the enzymes are available again, and that's just not true. If it is denatured, then it's gone. It's by all intents and purposes, it is no longer able to do its function. Now, had it not been denatured, then you get back into its pH and temperature optima, then yes, it has a chance of being able to do its job again.
Yeah. No, I appreciate Chris writing in with this. He's spot on. I agree. And it can be difficult when we're recording a 1 hour-ish show to be as clear as we would like. So if ever if we say something that you feel requires some clarification out there, feel free to send us in your feedback. And we really do appreciate it, and we're happy to clarify on the show. You can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com, or you can leave us a message by calling 951-444-0320. So my brewing consists entirely of beers made of malt, hops, yeast, and water. Actually, the last time I added anything other than those four main ingredients was a few years ago. And I'm not talking about water minerals or anything like that. And it was when I brewed this chocolate vanilla Dunkelweizen for a local competition. I know I'm likely in the minority on this. People really seem to enjoy experimenting with different additives. People like homebrewer Richard Reed, who sent me a wheat ale he made using the juice from a prickly pear.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
This is dark.
Yeah, it's like cloudy.
No, it's not dark. It's not dark. Not dark. Don't be confused. It's not dark like a stout or anything. It's hazy. How about that hazy?
Purple haze. Not much smell. That's good.
You're starting to like everything.
This
what
is
happened
good.
to you?
This is very drinkable.
Oh, damn it. It's good.
It is, see?
Too many tannins. Marshall, what's a tannin?
It's one more than ninin.
God, it's good.
Kind of apricotish.
I was going to say, just based off of the color and haziness, I was thinking apricot. I'm going to zen with you right now, Timmy. Maybe some apricot. Maybe
not.
Well, now that you said it, it's all that's in my mind. It's good.
I do like it.
We know like 4 flavors of beer. You want to branch out and just guess something? No, I'm with you. No, let's not. Let's just say that we like it. And
It's very good. I don't think it's an IPA.
no, it's definitely not an IPA. It's just good. It's a good PA.
It is very good.
As a learned man, I should know what it is.
Come on, Jersey. Dig deep.
No, if we guess wrong, we'll just look like idiots. If we say we like it, but we don't know what it is, they'll just think we're lovable fools who like good beer.
I'm going to go like an 8.
I'll give it a 6 for a 7, Jersey Tims.
Well, I'm not sure I've ever had prickly pear before, so I wasn't really sure what to expect from this beer, but really it tasted like a pretty solid American style wheat ale with an earthy, kind of slightly pineapple-like note that reminded me of a beer fermented with Brett C. Not that the character was super strong, it wasn't, just kind of this whisper behind the malt character. It was actually pretty nice beer, better than I expected, Richard. So thanks for sending it in. Malcolm, what are your thoughts on beers made with like prickly pear and stuff like that?
I don't like most beers brewed with prickly pear or any of those succulents, like, agave. They always come off as having this medicinal quality to me. I say always as if I'm always aware of it. So I'm not always aware of it, but there's a lot of big breweries out there that make, various beers with, cactus or agave and prickly pear and, insert whatever succulent. And like I said, they always have a pretty odd, earthy and medicinal character, almost like those honey cough drops.
Yeah.
I don't prefer it. I've had a few ones that are pretty good, I guess, that are acceptable, but if I was given a choice between that and a clean lager, I'm probably going clean lager.
I mean, yeah, me too. I will say though that Richard's beer, now I'm assuming it was prickly pear. He called it prickly wheat, and I believe there was like a prickly pear picture of that on his label. So I didn't get much more information, and if I did, I can't find it. But I'm pretty sure that's what was in there, and it was much better than I expected. And I'm not going to be brewing a beer with prickly pear anytime soon, but it was good. And so again, I did pick up some of that earthy thing that you were talking about, I think, but what really got me, what I found kind of striking was this pineapple note that I got from it. So pretty good stuff. Again, Richard, thanks for sending it in. If you have a beer or any other beverage that you would like reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We'll be right back after this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leach, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew-in-a-bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Ferment an ale too warm, and you risk producing a beer chock full of inappropriately strong fruity esters and potentially even hot fusel alcohols. Ferment too cool, and you might be left with a beer that at the very least is lacking in character, though could have undesirable flavors and possibly be under-attenuated. Of course, for the best results, it's recommended that fermentation temperature be very well controlled.
I think most often it's stated like this, lagers, cold, lower concentration, total concentration of phenols and esters, so less flavorful in general.
Yeah. And
then ales, warm, so, faster metabolic rate. And there's also a belief, and it does seem to follow suit with testing, is that ale strains tend to be more apt to produce compounds of esters and phenols at given temperatures. So,
right.
So it's somewhat strain dependent, but it's also said to be temperature impacted, regardless of the strain, independent of the strain.
And by ale strains, just to clarify, we're referring to Saccharomyces cerevisiae as opposed to
versus Pasteuranius.
Yeah, exactly, which is your typical traditional lager like strains that are known at least to be able to ferment cooler. We've done an episode on lager fermentation temperature in the past, and in this one we want to focus a little bit more on fermentation temperature in regards to ale strains.
Yeah, like I said, ales are typically fermented warmer, to say 20 Celsius and 68 Fahrenheit. That's about where ales are done, give or take.
Right. Room temperature is
Fahrenheit.
Room temperature is what I hear people referring to it as. Ales are your typical kind of room temp or what you can typically maintain in a closet in your house, depending on where you live.
And then even within that spectrum of ale, you have say something like the Chico strain, which is notably fairly clean for an ale. In fact, I've even done a beer that's been passed off as a lager with Chico.
Right.
And then just by upping the pitch rate and having a large, healthy, lots of oxygen too. So I've done beers that have been considered lagers on the professional scale even. We did an homage to Brewlosophy, though. This was before I was part of Brewlosophy. We did like a Mocktoberfest. It was basically a Oktoberfest grist with lots of Perla hops, and just fermented it around 58 degrees, So,
yeah.
But even within the ale category, you have Chico on one end, and then perhaps the Belgian strains, which are known to be very expressive, and the Belgian Hefeweizen strains, which are known to be fairly expressive. Notably, I think anyone who's gone to a beer class, for judging or what even just Beer 101 has talked about isoamyl acetate being an ester that smells of banana, or 4VG, 4-vinyl guaiacol, that smells and tastes of clove. Those are like the classic examples. So,
yeah.
And what are we told? If you ferment an ale, you ferment it warm, we're told that you'll get more of those. It does seem that colder seems to favor phenol production, and warmer does seem to favor ester production.
That claim is something that I recall reading about a while back in terms of certain, like you mentioned, Belgian strains, but also just really most really expressive yeast strains. I'm thinking in terms of like Belgian wit strains and Hefeweizen strains, that cooler environment with that ale yeast provides the I'm going to say a proper amount of stress, I guess, if what you're aiming for is kind of that clovey, spicy thing, and you get that 4VG phenol, that kind of, and this is I don't brew many of these types of beers, but, I had an experience where I had this competition I was mentioning where I brewed a Dunkelweizen, so a darker Hefeweizen that I ended up dosing with a bunch of stuff to make it. It was a weird competition, local competition. But what I was going for was one of those, the flavor of like those ice cream pops, the banana and chocolate ice cream pops. They kind of look like a rocket pop. And so what I ended up fermenting this Dunkelweizen at 72 under the impression that warmer fermentation temperatures really encourage ester production, whereas the cooler ones, I wanted to avoid that spicy clovey thing. I think that's an interesting thing. Then you've got, you think about the history of ale brewing, and it's you can't ignore the fact that the English were out there brewing up ale a long time ago, and they're kind of known for having a bit more, I guess, ester expression in the beers that come from that region.
Yeah, obviously a lot of the English beers are known for like the subtle apple, nuanced pear, and even a little tiny bit of banana. Usually if you get into banana and bubblegum, we're talking Belgium strains, Belgian strains. So yeah, I love English strains. I don't like when they're over the top because I think they take on this like caramel and bruised apple character. But when it's like that fresh flesh of apple and maybe even some apple skin, I like that flavor, especially combined with the typical earthy English hops. I think it's just lovely.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. You have the best descriptors, by the way. Bruised apple. I mean, we all know what that tastes like, but I would never think to say that. But yeah, I agree with you. And in thinking about, in particular, English yeast strains, you've got some, like for example, when I've fermented, your kind of traditional English ale with Saf Ale SO4, just anecdotal experience, I get kind of more of a mineral character from that I don't think that has anything to do necessarily with esters or phenols, but it does seem to, again, this is anecdote. It seems a little bit more strong the warmer I ferment that strain. I ferment with things like, the Fuller strain, which is a really, really popular one. I get a little bit more floral, fruity, a kind of fruit basket fruity, that I think, like you said, just blends phenomenally well with your typical English hops.
Yeah, nothing more to say than that. If you go too loud, it seems to throw off the balance. But if you keep it, I like my ales, I think, a little bit colder, especially the English strains. People like to do 68-ish. I tend for like 65, 66, 67. I'm not sure how much of a degree or two matters or where that theoretical cliff is.
Yeah.
But I like the profile I get when matched against like that mushroom, earth, and tea. That's a lot of times what I think of when I think of like the Fuggles and especially EKG. It's like orange pico tea.
Yeah.
And you match that up with a little bit of that fresh pear and fresh apple, and it's just good
It's
blend.
so good. Yeah, I'm getting thirsty talking about it. Of course, Germany, the region, the Bavarian region is known for Hefeweizen, which is another very characterful yeast. We talked a little bit about, fermentation temperature in terms of those types of strains. The warmer you go, typically the more isoamyl acetate or that banana flavor. And correct me if I'm wrong, Malcolm. I feel like the warm banana, cool clove thing, I only first started hearing about that maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's been a kind of people argue against it, that it's really more strain dependent, and that you can pull both of those characteristics regardless of the temperature that you're fermenting at.
So the answer there is yes. For a given temperature, one strain may favor, just because of genetics. In selective pressure, we've coaxed this one strain into doing this. So for a given temperature, one strain may produce more 4VG in the presence. You got to consider everything else equal. So if the amount of precursors, the ferulic acid, is the same, one strain at a certain temperature may produce more 4VG.
Right.
Clove. And now you take that same strain, you start altering one of those things, you may change the balance. So I don't have all the strains in front of me and I haven't memorized them all, but let's just say like the very classic WLP 300, which is, whoever it is.
I think that's the Weihenstephaner. Yeah.
Yeah, Weihenstephaner. So that one, to me, is has a big swath of temperatures you can play in and still make a very good Hefeweizen, but it does seem to kind of lack clove. So what people do is ferment cooler. And now so the science says there's two things going on. One, at that cooler temperature, yes, you are favoring the production of phenols and kind of suppressing the temperature or the production of esters. But I also wonder if it also becomes the whole, and we use it a lot, whispering in a church versus whispering in a concert.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't go to churches, so I'm assuming that's what happens.
I barely go to concerts these days either. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
So because the esters are lower, does the phenol stand out more? But we know from scientific trials and actual analysis that does seem to also favor the production of phenols. But it's like anything else you research on the interwebs. You can find an article that agrees with you. So I found some interviews with some prominent brewmasters that and these guys are studied. They have degrees and experience, so it's not like they're just flying off the cuff and making things up.
Right.
But they'll say that higher temperatures don't always result in higher ester production, because higher temperatures during the growth phase, you've already used up the enzyme that produces, it's part of the pathway to esters. So it's the coenzyme alpha. So that's being used up during the growth phase. So they're like, well, high temperature doesn't matter. So, so it flies in the face of the common dogma, our dictation. So it's only one or two sources that say that. Pretty much if you Googleize or web search temperature and phenols, temperature and esters, you'll find that the two common, increased metabolic rate, increased byproduct production.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's the most commonly stated thing.
Yeah. And it really, I mean, what's interesting is everyone who makes a starter, I would have to, at the very least for me, when I make a starter, that starter wort is spinning on my stir plate at probably 70, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And, outside of the finished fermenting starter, smelling like the yeast that I pitched into it, very rarely have I been blown away by how estery it is. You treat starters pretty poorly. Like you'd never treat a beer that way. So, I think it's interesting, but at the very least, controlling fermentation temperature, you ask any brewer who, is finally making beer that they enjoy, what the biggest, change in their process was. And, they're likely to say that it was, controlling fermentation temperature and maybe making yeast starters. So, it is something that I feel like at the very least is good practice, in order for controllability and to improve predictability of the outcome. So let's kind of start off from a really simplistic ways that one might think about going about controlling fermentation temperature, and then moved toward more advanced methods.
The easiest way is just to find a spot in your house that correlates with the beer you want to make. So I used to do this all the time. I lived in Hawaii. I was stationed there, and my roommates used to always laugh at me. I was controlling like the louvers, for the cross breeze, and I knew if I did that, my bathroom was like around 67. And to minimize swing, I used to fill up the bathtub. I lucky enough, I drew the proper straw to have one of the bedrooms in our apartment that had a bathroom.
Yeah.
So I used to fill the bathtub up to almost the same level as the beer. I'd cover it with a towel, and I have to say, on more than one occasion, we're sitting there watching a movie or cooking, and one of my roommates would look over at me and goes, "Hey, do you hear water?" So I was filling the tub up. I did this, hurdle move, over the couch, like, "Oh my God,"
Oh shit!
My roommate would come up from upstairs, and he'd be like, "Hey, it's raining in my room."
Right.
But
oh God.
So that was using ambient and obviously increasing thermal mass by having a large volume. And you can do that with a tub, like one of those keg tubs, and then you can do the bottles of ice. So I used to freeze like 1 or 2 liter bottles of water. Kind of squeeze them, fill them up 3/4 of the way. Put them in the freezer. Then you're always like putting them in there, trying to control it. It's kind of crude, but you can keep the beer at least under 80 degrees or 75 degrees if you live in a very warm area. And then you can also augment that with a fan, and now you're doing like a swamp cooler.
Yeah.
So you're getting the evaporative effect too. And you can actually do pretty well. You might have a 5-degree swing. You might up to 10 maybe, especially if you have a long work day and it's very warm. But it's more economical than using AC to cool your whole house.
I've heard of people doing this.
I cannot say I've not done that.
So what you're referring to, I think people call it a water bath, and then kind of an additional approach to that is, like you said, a swamp cooler. A lot of people will take a towel and wet that towel, leave the bottom of the towel kind of submerged in the water, and then when you blow that fan over it, it's essentially wicking off the heat. And the heat that we're referring to, what you're trying to control for, is the exothermic heat that's created just by the fermentation itself. And that can, in my experience, in my observation, you can if you've got a house that is smack at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, you can that's 19 degrees C. You can get exothermic heat that raises that temperature upwards of 72 degrees or so, which I believe is about 23.
10 to 15 degrees is not uncommon, man.
No, yeah.
You can, You've done, in fact, even in the original version of John Palmer's How to Brew online, I think he was noticing he did a probe in the center and probe on the side, and he was getting like 10, 15 degrees. I mean, I'm loosely quoting, so I don't remember exact. Those are degrees Fahrenheit, but evaporative cooling, man, you can get, once you get good at it and you know the sweet spots, and you can get 10 degrees easy on evaporative cooling. You know, as far as temperature suppression, way back in the desert, you know, we're talking, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. Well, I guess thousands of years ago, they made ice in the desert with evaporative cooling towers. You know, so you know, it can be done, and it just takes a little bit of futzing with, you know, your fan and your water temperatures and what area in your room is. Yeah, but you can mess with that, because I remember in my old house in PA, because the AC unit was downstairs, right near my AC unit, and the basement stayed cooler anyways because it was underground and it was all cement. So if the upstairs of my house was like 68, 69 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's, you know, once around 120 C, the basement was usually 2 or 3 degrees cooler, at least, you know, so that you can make use of that. You know, if you have a cool area in your house, or if you're doing a Hefeweizen or a Saison, you know, one closet in your house is a bit warmer, you can move the beer there.
Exactly.
So it's a bit cumbersome, but you can do it.
Yeah, well, and you know, evaporative cooling, the water bath, it's crude, but it does work, and there are a lot of people out there who are using those methods. In fact, there are some products that have been invented. I forget exactly what they're called, but like these bags that you wrap your fermenter in, and then you just put ice, you know. And so it is a method that will absolutely control fermentation temperature for you. Another sort of crude way, I think you were kind of alluding to it, is just finding a cool spot. You know, during the wintertime here in Fresno, it's hot as hell during the summertime, but during the winter we drop down into the 40s. Woo, it's nuts. And you know, 5 degrees Celsius, man, just crazy stuff here in the wintertime. But if I could actually, and I've done this, put my fermenter next to a window in a room that we don't use very often, and just crack that window, and it'll stay nice and cool. I've kept beers below 66 degrees before, and so that works as well. I think as we move up in the ranks and we start brewing more, we want a little bit more control, and perhaps the most common form of temperature control that I see, at least with home brewers at this point, is buying some form of a chest freezer or a refrigerator that is converted into a temperature controlled fermentation chamber.
Yeah, you buy a controller. You know, you can usually find one of those controllers, you know, online, you know, wherever, Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, whatever. You buy a controller for cheap, or you can buy one new. Just about every homebrew shop has their own branded version now too. Yeah. But, you know, so you go buy a controller, spend $5 to $100 on it. You plug that into the wall, and you plug your chest freezer, and you can use a refrigerator too, into that. Put the probe into that vessel space, or directly against. You can tape it against the fermentation vessel, be it a brew bucket or a carboy. I've seen people put insulation over the top of it, either bubble wrap or cut up an old koozie and make it insulated. Then you tape that probe to the fermentation vessel, and you set the controller, and boom, there you go. And that usually is within 5 degrees, and that has a good reliability. You know, a lot of people ferment that way. So
I've actually done the measurement. You mentioned what John talked about in his book about measuring the actual temperature of the beer and comparing that to the temperature of the outside of the fermenter. I've done the measure. I've done the comparison, and they are, whether it's you're in the middle of vigorous fermentation or end of fermentation or beginning, they have always been within 1 degree Fahrenheit of each other, which is about 0.5 degree Celsius. I mean, that is a level of precision that, for as easy as it is to get with this, it just makes guys like me feel really good, right? Because part of the fun of brewing for some of us is predictability, the ability to consistently produce a quality product that you kind of know how it's going to turn out. And I feel like that's to this day, I still am very, very precise about my fermentation temperatures. You could also buy a thermo well that you can use. I think most types of fermentation vessels out there have some sort of thermal well that you can buy, and you stick your probe down in a stainless tube that is actually inside your fermenter, the fermenting beer. But again, you know, I use a little bit of insulation and tape it to the side of my fermenter, and I'm able to control those temperatures really well doing that.
I'll say another problem that some people have is not getting it hot enough. So if you are like in a colder environment, so this might get out there for you, but I don't know if you know this, but some places get freezing cold in the U.S. There,
I don't like to go to those places.
So in PA, one of my fermentation vessels, I had like the smaller chest freezers, and it would be in my garage. So my garage could get down, into the 40s and 50s. What I would do was put a reptile lamp, plug it in,
sure,
and heat instead of cool. So I would have I could either unplug my cooling method and just use that as an insulation box, or you could have both with two controllers. But you just use a reptile. You can use actually a regular incandescent lamp because they're inefficient at making light, but very efficient at making heat.
Right.
And you can kind of cover it. But, for a couple dollars, you can buy one of those reptile bulbs, which do not emit, light that will damage or skunk your beer. So put that in that vessel, whatever your vessel is, and you can heat your beer instead of cool your beer if you need to do that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when we talk about fermentation temperature control. It's like 95% focused on cooling, keeping your fermenting beer cool. But even I promise you, I still have to use the heater in the dead of winter here in the Central Valley. And what I use, I don't recommend it because people say that it's terrible and bad and all that. But I actually use a ceramic heater that I've plugged into my temperature controller, and it does the trick really well. It's super quick. And but again, I'm not sure I would recommend that to anyone if you're not like into taking risks like me, I guess. I've also used a paint can heater. I think if you Google paint can heater,
that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, right. You use an incandescent light
bulb
inside of a paint can, so there's no light emitted, but you get a lot of heat, especially if you're using like a 100-watt light bulb. All kinds of ways. There's also these heating pads that you can buy at homebrew shops and whatnot. Those are really popular as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some advanced methods for temperature control, because I know there are some people out there who are equally as nerdy as you, Malcolm. You're using a glycol setup.
Yeah, mine right now is it's a rig that was designed and branded by SSBrewtech, right? Now, previous to that though, I had made various versions of DIY do-it-yourself glycol chillers using an AC unit and a glycol bath and running it through coils. So, I mean, I've done that too. You can build those for a reasonable price, especially if you find or buy find a used or have one in your garage, or you buy a used AC unit,
Right.
I've made them for stills, allegedly. I've used them for cooling various other things, and I've given a few away. I've also had them fail and break and have other issues. So I just got kind of sick of the way it looked and kind of sick of the way it functioned. So since I started using the SSBrewtech one, it's pretty easy. After a couple minimalistic hacks, such as buying, quick release glycol line attachments, it's brainless. You set it up once, you use it. I can control my temperature within, like I said, 1 degree. I can probably go half degree if I wanted to, and it will change temperature as you watch it. So I've taken, middle of the summer in PA groundwater temperatures. For me, I could only get my beer down to like 70, and I wanted to do a lager. Take the entire vessel, fill it up, hook it up to the glycol. It would go from 70 to like 50 right before your eyes. It took like maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
That's
maybe
crazy.
5.
Oh man, that's amazing. Yeah. And Jake, our contributor, Jake Houlihan, he went out and bought the same exact glycol chiller that you've got, based purely on what you were saying, and he loves it just as much as you do. I know that there's another. You don't have to use the glycol chiller. There are various like conical fermenters out there that have a chilling coil that stays. Correct me if I'm wrong on this one, Malcolm. That coil stays inside the beer during fermentation. You can actually set up a pump system that will push not glycol but just cold water through that coil.
Yeah, I did that for several months, almost a half a year. I was just, instead of doing the water bath, having your carboy in a water bath and changing ice, floating ice bottles around your carboy, I was doing this for glycol instead of glycol. So I made a saline solution and was floating ice in this cooler to, kind of kept it colder longer. So I cut holes out and was running tubes of just ice water through. And ice water, obviously 30 to 32, 33, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Degrees Fahrenheit. So you're somewhere around there. But once you exhausted the thermal capacity of that cooler, especially if I was fermenting in my garage, I would go to work, I would come back, my garage would be, 80 degrees or whatever. All that water might have been, all that ice might have been melted by that time.
Sure.
Whereas now the glycol system would kick on and chill the glycol down to like 28 degrees, so that's the difference. You might have had a few degrees swing, so you can really get a huge cooler and load it up with ice water and kind of combat that a little bit, but it took more maintenance, it took more attention.
So glycol stays, you said, about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which was about a -1 degree Celsius or so. It maintains that coolness, right? So it's getting constantly pumped through these coils, and it's triggered by a temperature controller that then turns a pump on. I'm assuming that's how it works?
Yeah, there's one pump to control the glycol flow through the coil in the fermentation vessel. So that has a probe into the fermentation vessel that kicks on the pump, which pumps the glycol, and it's assuming the glycol is at some temperature X that you set it at.
Yeah.
So the fermentation temperature controller on the fermentation vessel is blind. It doesn't know if you're pumping hot water through it or cold water through it. All it says is temperature's too high, give me this cold liquid, and it pumps it through it. And then once the temperature set point gets below, its set point, then it shuts it off.
Yeah.
So now inside the glycol chiller, it maintains the glycol at whatever temperature. So typical is 28 Fahrenheit or -1°C. So what that happens is when the fermentation vessel says demand, give me cold liquid, it's obviously going to increase the temperature of the glycol itself. So now the glycol unit, it has a set point, usually 1 or 2 degrees. And when it gets warm, because of the beer it's trying to cool, the compressor turns on and cools the glycol.
Yeah.
So you can have up to 7, I think, whatever it is. It's rated for size. So the number will depend on how big each fermentation vessel is. But let's just say it's 7 5-gallon fermentation vessels, might be 5, whatever. But it can run 7 5-gallon fermentations because it has enough cooling capacity in the compressor to counteract the exothermic reaction of fermentation plus ambient.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, there's all of these different ways to control fermentation temperature. And again, we were curious whether it really mattered and what type of a difference it would make. And of course, this wouldn't be the Brewlosophy podcast if we didn't have some experiments to discuss. Results of those and our thoughts when we return from this short break. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the exGEERitor, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERitor.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Well, it wasn't long ago I believed with dogmatic fervor that even the slightest temperature changes during fermentation would have a noticeable effect. And no joke, I was convinced that a beer fermented at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, so 20 degrees C, would have more esters, like noticeably more ester character than the same beer fermented at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees C. I decided to put this to the test, and this was one of the first experiments we did on the site. I opted to make a Schwartz beer using one of my favorite yeasts at the time. It is the PJ Froof strain, WLP029. I'd been experimenting with using that strain in different types of lager beers, and a lot of people weren't very happy with that, but it was working out well for me. But what I was doing was fermenting with the yeast a little bit lower than what White Labs recommended. So I think their recommendation for that is a little bit cooler ale temp, so like 62 to 64, something like that. And so what I did is I brewed up this 10-gallon batch of Schwartz beer, split it between two carboys, and then I chilled both of those worts down to 56 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees C. The idea there being that I didn't want pitch temperature to play a role. And at the time, again, one of the things that was talked about a lot is that the temperature that you pitch your yeast at can have an impact on the beer. So for this one, pitching temperature was controlled. So they were both pitched at 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees C. And then I moved one of the carboys into my spare shower, which at the time, this was late winter, moved it into the spare shower. It maintained a temperature of about 66 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit in the house. So one of them stayed in the firm chamber at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees C. The other one, again, was just ambient temperature in my house and kind of went between 66F to 72F, which is about 19C to 22C throughout fermentation. Some observations of fermentation. I think predictably, the warm fermentation batch took off sooner. It was more active, and it seemed to finish up sooner as well. And Malcolm, you've mentioned before that, with chemical reactions, the warmer the environment is, the quicker they seem to take place.
Yeah, so that's one of the givens. So no matter which side of the research you find when you're looking for confirming information, one of the things that's a given is that, yes, if you ferment warmer, it will ferment quicker.
Yeah.
So it will reduce the sugars at a faster rate, but that also seems to exhaust the yeast. So funny enough, you have less viable yeast down the road. But that's a different topic.
Yeah. It's but that was very obvious in observing the differences between these beers during fermentation. After about 4 full days of fermentation, both beers were kind of waning. The activity was kind of waning in both beers. So I brought them both up to the same 60, I believe it was 66 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees C for a diacetyl rest. Let them sit for a couple of days before taking hydrometer measurements that showed both beers hit the same exact FG. It was 1014 FG. From there, I cold crashed, fined both with gelatin, and I kegged them up, carbonated them to the same level, and then I ended up serving them to 23 participants. Now, at 23 participants, 13 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say that these beers were noticeably different or that they could be reliably distinguished. But in the end, only 9 people were able to tell these beers apart, and those folks, even, I don't think were very confident in their guess, but in their selections. And I recall having a couple conversations. This was a while ago, but the data that I collected out in my garage, the interesting remarks to me, what was interesting was that nobody commented on there being more esters in the warm fermented beer. And I didn't get any comments about the cool fermented beer being necessarily cleaner. Now, in my own impressions, when I was tasting these beers, biased as I was able, in 2 triangle tests, I was able to pick out the odd beer out. And of course, I guess I noticed more esters in the warm fermented sample. But so, when we published these results, a few people kind of spoke up and said, well, geez, you use this notably clean yeast. But I don't know, Malcolm. To me, at the time, I was fully convinced, man, a 2-degree swing in temperature during fermentation is going to have an impact on the beer. And this just, didn't seem to support that.
Well, funny, because when I was, I go through phases. Well, I used to when I was competing. I'd go through phases where I was really concentrating on a beer. And one of my friends, Keith Cost, he was doing Dr. Homebrew for a while. He was really good at making a kolsch. So, I asked him to share some tips and tricks, and he did. And I was fermenting my kolsches at the recommended temperatures, maybe a slightly cooler.
Yeah.
From White Labs. So he was starting his even cooler. He was starting them like 58, kind of like what you did.
Yeah.
And letting them come up slowly to like 62, 63. So he was really trying to keep them clean, because we both agreed that, warmer fermented kolsches were too apple, So here we're talking about, 4-degree Fahrenheit difference, just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius different. And we were going down to that level, thinking like this really matters.
Yeah.
And, it seemed to work out. I don't know what else I was doing to make the beer better, seemingly better, because it started performing better in competition. So there's that, if you want to call that evidence, there's that.
Yeah.
But that's what we were doing,
Yeah.
So, and all of a sudden I started doing well with my kolsch in competition. So, like I said, who knows what else was causing that?
Yeah.
Or was it temperature?
Well, and one of the speaking of Dr. Homebrew, this beer was, I drove on my butt out to Concord and went on Dr. Homebrew with JP from the Brewing Network. So you can go back and listen to that episode as well. Listen to the guys do the triangle test live on the show. But one of the some of the kind of complaints, I guess, that we got about this experiment, one was that it was a Schwartz beer, which means there was a little bit of roasted malt in it, and that may have gotten in the way of any perceivable differences. The other one was that the yeast was just too clean, and that we should try it with a more expressive type of yeast. And so what we did is we designed a couple more experiments. First, I want to tell everyone about Imperial Yeast, who are providing brewers with the finest quality yeast on the market. Packing 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch, brewers are ensured a quick and healthy fermentation. With a wide range of ale and lager strains, as well as some funkier stuff, Imperial Yeast is sure to have what you need to turn your wort into delicious beer. Go check out everything they have to offer at imperialyeast.com today. And we've been doing some fun fermentation experiment stuff with fermentation temperature stuff with Imperial as well. All right. So after the complaints, I thought, you know what? I'm really interested in this whole expressive yeast thing. And so I'm going to go, I chose the Fuller strain, which is a White Labs 002. Imperial has it as pub ale. Very common English strain that is known for being somewhat like we were talking about earlier, a little bit more fruity esters come from it. And so what I did is I brewed up a batch of English mild, low OG. I'm thinking, okay, if I go low OG on this one, then the alcohol's not going to get in the way of the differences. Brewed a 10-gallon batch, split it between fermenters. Now, one of the differences between this one and the other one, and this was another complaint we got, was that pitch at fermentation temperature. Don't do this whole low equalized pitch temp thing. So that's what we did on this one. Split the wort between 2 carboys, pitched one and fermented it at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, which is my sweet spot. That's 19 degrees C when I'm using that strain. The other one, I wanted to be nice and even, 10 degrees Fahrenheit higher. So I pitched it and fermented it at 76 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 24 degrees C. That's a lot. That's really warm. I would never intentionally ferment an English ale that warm. Malcolm, what about you?
No, like I said in the previous segment, I actually ferment my English ales slightly cooler than is standard.
Yeah.
Well, at least I used to. And lately, I've been creeping them up a little bit. So yeah. What you're calling complaints, I consider constructive feedback from the readers. Thank you. Keep them up.
I love it too. I don't mean complaints in a negative way.
I love the fact that you not only brewed the wrong beer, but you brewed at the wrong temperatures and the wrong yeast. So that was awesome.
It was all bad.
And on this one, you screwed up because you made it too low of a gravity. So there's no way we'll tell a difference.
Yes, that was the constructive feedback that I got on this one.
Yeah.
But it was a thought out decision. I don't brew much mild, but we went with it because we wanted to see if the ester different. Again, we didn't want the alcohol or any too much malt character to get in the way of the fermentation character. So again, I observed that the warm fermentation temperature beer took off sooner, was more active and finished sooner. Both of them were pretty quick though. I mean, neither of these fermentation temperatures were too cool. And in fact, it looked like signs of fermentation were basically gone after about 3 full days post-pitch. So I moved the beers next to each other and let them sit another couple of days, right around 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 C. Diacetyl rest, that strain, the fuller strain, is kind of known for producing some diacetyl, and I wanted to avoid that. The warm fermentation temperature beer ended up finishing at 1010 FG, while the cool fermentation temperature beer finished just slightly higher at 1011 FG. I'm not sure if that was a function of temperature or not, but an interesting observation to say the least. The beers were both cold crashed fined with gelatin, and then I kegged them up and carbonated them to the same level. On this one, I served the beers to 22 participants, all blind, so they didn't know what the variable was that we were testing here. And at 22 participants, exactly half, 11 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say that the beers were reliably distinguishable. And in the end, 12 people actually were able to pick out the different beer, which means that this was a significant finding. These beers, we could say that they were different enough that a number of people were able to reliably distinguish the warm ferment beer from the cool ferment beer. Now, the interesting thing to me on this one was the conversations that I had with folks after taking the survey. Again, not a single person noted that the warm fermentation temperature beer was more estery than the cool. Now, that was my expectation, right? Not a single person noted that. In fact, the most common feedback that I got had to do with the fact that the warm fermentation temperature beer tasted a little bit thinner, was less flavorful. Same thing with the aroma. And I think the majority of people actually said they preferred the warm fermentation temp beer to the one that was fermented at my ideal temperature range. Now, I fully expected the warm ferment beer to be a fruit bomb with hot alcohol flavors. But again, even when I was drinking it, that just wasn't the case at all. The beer was the warm ferment beer was perceptibly cleaner to me. Again, I kind of aligned with the tasters on this one. It was a little bit thinner. But it was a good beer that was fermented at 76 degrees Fahrenheit. I just still to this day, I would never intentionally do that. But the whole keg, we drank the whole thing. I didn't toss it. I mean, it was not bad.
Well, so I'm going to mention this study. We're not going to go over it, but I encourage readers to go look at it. It's titled "Effects of Fermentation Temperature on the Composition of Beer Volatile Compounds, Organoleptic Quality, and Spent Yeast Density." It's a 2011 paper put out by African university. I think it's the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So that's KWA Zulu-Natal. And funny enough, just briefly, at versus the control room temperature fermentation for 2 different strains was slightly higher ester and sulfur compounds. But then when they went from room temperature, which I assume is somewhere around 20 Celsius, 68 F, when they went to 22.5 Celsius, which is I think 72.
Right around 72 F, yeah.
Most compounds went up in intensity. So their concentration went up. But then when they upped it to 25 Celsius, which I think is 77 Fahrenheit, a lot of the compounds went down. So it wasn't correlated to every single compound, all phenols, all esters, all sulfur-based compounds. They didn't all follow the same track, mind you. So it's worth going to look at. But it's an interesting paper, and a lot of it flies in the face of a lot of the assumptions that we make. And so these were all done with gas chromatograph and mass spectrophotometry, or spectrometry, and it's worth a read. And it kind of follows a line with what you said about the higher temperature one being less flavorful, because potentially for this particular yeast strain, maybe you went over that theoretical hump and you're at the point where you started suppressing some of the compounds. So maybe your cooler one, so cooler in quotations because it's all relative, your cooler one, maybe you were at peak compound production for that yeast strain and for that wort composition. And then when you went higher, this is all assumptions, of course, but then when you went higher, maybe you were starting to come down the other side of that curve.
Yeah, that's interesting thought.
That's interesting to me. And it's going to be strain dependent. It's going to be wort composition dependent. It's going to be oxygen dependent. So we control as much as we can in our garages for these experiments, but one thing you did, your one variable was temperature. So that is very interesting.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a really interesting way to think about it. Well, even though this particular experiment was significant, people still wanted to see, and we're included in this group of people who wanted to see how fermentation temperature would impact an even more characterful yeast. So Malcolm, you designed an experiment where you actually brewed a Hefeweizen.
That's the classic yeast, when we talk about esters and phenols. So I thought it was the perfect example, and it met a lot of the constructive feedback from the readers and commenters. So I did a moderate gravity Hefeweizen. I did a characterful yeast being Hefeweizen. I believe I did a ferulic acid rest. I did. So my first step is at 112 Fahrenheit, 45 C. So I tried to coax that out, and we fermented and it was a traditional Hefeweizen recipe, but my fermentation temperatures were...
you did 60 Fahrenheit or 16 C versus 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 C.
Yeah, 60 was one of the temperatures I was fermenting at, actually a little bit cooler. So when I was doing competition Hefeweizens, I was doing around 62 to try to, control those levers to get some more clove and suppress the banana. I never had any problem getting banana out of most Hefeweizen strains. It was the clove I was after. So hence the ferulic acid rest on both. I had to keep that the same. And 72 is not outrageous for a lot of people doing Hefeweizens, because Hefeweizen is considered to be one of those forgivable beers where you can just grip it and rip it.
Yeah.
But good beginner beer, you can put it in a cooler area of your house and you'll probably be around 68, 72, right?
Right.
So this is 12 degrees Fahrenheit difference. I thought that was substantial in this regard.
Yeah. So other than the temperature difference, though, these beers were treated exactly the same. And just a little note on for those who may not know what a ferulic acid rest is, that is a temperature rest that encourages basically ferulic acid, which yeast then metabolizes and turns into 4-VG. Is that close to being correct?
Yeah. So Hefeweizen yeast is one of the yeasts that is considered POF positive, or phenolic off flavor positive. That term has been less used lately, and people will say the yeast has the PAD1 gene.
Right.
So the PAD1 gene is basically saying that the yeast contains the gene that will convert acid precursors into the phenols. So pad 1 is phenylacrylic acid decarboxylase. So in the presence of ferulic acid, POF positive, our pad 1 gene positive yeasts will create said phenols. Right. So we try to create an environment that would favor the production of clove.
Right. In part because that's how you brew. That's how you typically brew Hefeweizen. But also, both of these beers were going to be treated exactly the same regardless. And so we were interested to see if that clove character would come through in the 72 degree Fahrenheit beer as well. So anyways, these beers get fermented, they're kegged up, and you serve them to a nice big pool of participants, 32 people.
Yeah. Hopefully I can do this again here in Georgia, but in PA, I was blessed with a large home brewer pool, and the breweries allowed me to serve these beers for my panels. Unfortunately, here in Georgia, you can't serve homebrew in a place that serves alcohol.
Yeah.
So that's insanity to me. Anyways, but large sample size, and I needed 16. I got 19. So people, according to this test, were able to reliably distinguish between the two beers.
That's right. And the fact is it corroborates, it lines up with the previously discussed experiment, which again, I think it can be argued that the fuller strain, like most English ale strains, are going to be slightly more expressive than cleaner German style strains or, cleaner American style ale strains. And what it seems to suggest here is that, the more characterful that yeast, the more, it's almost like there's multiple variables that go into fermentation characteristic ultimately in beer, and that you can't just say fermentation temperature is going to cause this. You're going to get more esters regardless of what strain you're using. No, what it seems like is that the temperature is sort of strain dependent as well. So with it seems even more so with, say, a Hefeweizen yeast strain, that the warmer you ferment it, you're going to get a different characteristic than if you ferment it cooler. We'll get to your impressions in a second, but what really interested me was the preference question. And this is, you've got, you're trying to think like, well, what you've got this, ostensibly you've got a 72 degree Fahrenheit banana Hefeweizen and a 60 degree Fahrenheit clove. Again, this is all presumed. What are people going to like more? You've got 7 who preferred the one that was fermented warm, 8 preferred the one that was fermented cool, and 4, even though they noticed a difference, were like, whatever. I don't have a preference. They're both fine. Malcolm, what were your impressions about these beers? Were you able to tell them apart reliably on your own?
Yeah, I could. Enough such that when I decided to enter this beer, because usually I was trying to line up my experiments with competition, so I noticed them differently when I did my blind triangles, to the point where I used a blend of the beers to enter. So I took another keg, purged it, and I think I did 25% cool and 75% warm ferment, and ended up getting a third in 2017 beer and sweat competition. So I was pretty stoked about that.
Hell yeah.
But I wonder, you always wonder, was my blend right? Had I gone 35% cool, would I have gotten second or first?
Well, what I wonder is whether a middle range fermentation temperature would have produced something closer to the blend. So if you had gone a 65F or something like that, would you have gotten closer to the blend that you ended up making? That'd be an interesting experiment, actually.
Yeah, it'd be neat to be able to do like a blend, and then can you reproduce the moderate fermentation by basically mixing paints,
Yeah, exactly.
Yellow and blue make green, I'm always, we always go back and forth on this, but I'm always most enthralled or interested in the preference question. I like it because I'm always one to correct someone when they say this is different or this is better.
Yeah, right.
Well, which one's better? And I go, what's your favorite color? Want to argue about that?
Well, if it's good for anything, it's good for kind of proving that preference is completely subjective. So I'm with you on that.
Which I love. I love it.
Yeah.
I love the fact that here you have 12 degrees Fahrenheit difference, 7 degrees or 4 and 2 is 6 degrees Celsius difference, and a reliable amount of people, or a significant number of people, could tell. But down the line, I prefer this one. I prefer that one.
Exactly.
It just goes to show.
Yeah. Well, and with that, we're coming up to the end of the show here, and I like to end with kind of where we're at. And a lot of people will kind of point the finger at us sometimes, and so you're suggesting people shouldn't control their fermentation temperature. Well, no, I still control fermentation temperature. I absolutely believe that you can produce very good beer without, having a fermentation chamber and a controller or a nice glycol system. But again, for me, these results have only served to kind of buttress my belief in the predictability and controllability aspect of brewing and fermentation temperature control. That's the main reason that I will forever control fermentation temperatures. I don't buy into this idea, and it sort of goes along with what you were saying, Malcolm, about preference. I don't buy into this idea that fermentation temperature control is the end all be all, like only way to make the best beer. I do absolutely believe that the ability to consistently control that fermentation temperature is going to play through and play out in the consistency of the beer that you produce as well.
Well, I think with a lot of things with brewing, it's staying within the lines. So if you're within the lines, so if you're within these guidelines of detectability, perceptibility, you're probably okay. Now, what that buffer is will change depending on the gravity, the makeup of the wort, how you oxygenate, and the strain you're using.
Absolutely.
So you might be able to get away with 5-6 degrees difference on a Chico strain, or notably 3470 is temperature tolerant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a lager strain. Now try to do that same thing with the Hefeweizen, and obviously we went 12 degrees Fahrenheit on that one, so we're talking a bit wider out. But what if we kept doing that Hefeweizen experiment, but kept walking in the delta on temperature? At some point, the ability to perceive it, I have to guess, would go away.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean,
so it's going to depend. Maybe it's 15 degrees on 3470, but maybe it's 4 or 5 degrees with a Hefeweizen or an English strain.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, I think we can say that it's more than just fermentation temperature, like you mentioned. It's strain dependent. It's also probably the OG of your wort and whatnot. So,
well, start taking away other things, Marshall. So say you don't have a good oxygenation method. So now we're talking low oxygen, and now you want to mess with temperature. So no, maybe temperature was helping you overcome that one detriment. So if you can oxygenate sufficiently, maybe you have more room to wiggle on. And it goes on down the line.
Yeah.
If you have less healthy yeast, maybe you need to better control temperature.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, for sure. And it's something, I'm going to probably speak for you here, but we're still going to be controlling the fermentation temperature of the beers that we make. And I think, for people out there who are into predictability and controllability, it's probably the best way to go. And you've got various ways to go about doing that. Malcolm, that's all the time we got for this show. You got anything else you want to say about fermentation temperature?
I think I just wrapped it up decently.
All right, man. Well, if you want to read more about the experiments that we discussed in this episode, you can head over to brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.